Okay, so I mentioned briefly before that right after Shabbos, we found out that two very different leaders in the Torah community had passed away. One was Rabbi David Feinstein, who Rabbi Chait will be speaking about later in the week, as he is much more qualified than the rest of us to speak about Rabbi David, who he actually has a relationship with. And the other was Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sacks, who passed away yesterday morning after a very quick battle with cancer. He was diagnosed. He had a bout of cancer in his 30s, a bout of cancer in his 50s, and he was diagnosed again 3 weeks ago and passed away over Shabbos. So Rabbi Ginsburg asked me if I could address it for a few minutes. I'll be honest that I am not sure I'm fully qualified to speak about it, but we should say something. Rabbi Sacks, I assume all of you know, was from, I think for 12 years, was the chief rabbi of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, which is the official title of it. It really is the entire Commonwealth. I didn't quite know that, but now, Shana Bad guys know I have mishpacha connections to the current chief rabbi, so I've learned that it actually is the entire Commonwealth. Rabbi Sacks was known not as a unique Talmud Chacham and unique personality in the Jewish world. Right, he wasn't known for his halachic writings, for his writings on Gemara. He was known really as a spokesman for Judaism, to the world at large, and it was recognized as such by Jews and non-Jews alike. Hence his lordship. Right, he was first granted knighthood by the Queen, and eventually became a member of the House of Lords, which, if you don't quite understand British politics, means that he actually had a vote in the equivalent of our Senate, in recognition of being a thought leader. And it's hard to really pin down his contributions, because they really were far-reaching in terms of what he wrote, in terms of what he spoke about. So I'll give you some initial thoughts. And again, don't do it justice, but I think it's worth talking about. So last night I saw that Rabbi Alex Israel posted that several years ago Rabbi Sacks had come to visit Eretz HaTzvi, which is one of the places that Rabbi Israel teaches. And he had mentioned to Rabbi Sacks something about how he was a modern Orthodox leader. And Rabbi Sacks got very upset, and he said, I don't want to be a modern Orthodox leader. He said, to be a modern Orthodox leader is to be a sliver of a sliver of a sliver, right? Jews are a tiny sliver of the world. Orthodox Jewry is an even smaller sliver of the world. And modern Orthodoxy is an even smaller sliver of the world. What is the value in identifying yourself as a modern Orthodox leader? So he said, okay, well, what does a leader look like? What does it mean to be a leader? And he pointed to this week's Parsha, and he said, well, how is Avram introduced in this week's Parsha? Is Nisi Elokim Ata B'tochenu. Right? The way he held himself was that the nations of the world, right? The Chitim, they look at him and they say, right, Nisi Elokim Ata B'tochenu. Right? You are the Prince of God. You're a representative of God. That everybody in the world looks at him. And Rabbi Sacks very much, as Rabbi Israel wrote, that was his goal in life. Right? He wasn't, yes, he may have embodied in many ways the ideals of what we call modern Orthodoxy or centrist Orthodoxy or whatever you want to call it. Right? He was someone who was engaged with the world, had a PhD in philosophy, was Cambridge and Oxford educated, was eloquent and brought the best of the West into conversation with the Torah and the best of Torah into conversation with the West. So in that sense, people within the modern Orthodox world identified with him, but that wasn't his goal in life. Right? Rabbi Sacks believed very much that the goal of someone who represents Torah is to speak about Torah in a way that the world will look and say, Rak am chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh, that the nation that embodies these values is wise because it has something to speak. It has something to say to the world. And therefore he devoted his life to this. Now I know whenever Americans heard him, he sounded even more eloquent than I'm sure he did in British ears because we're suckers for accent. But even if you just look at the way he wrote, Avi is laughing because he knows it's true. It is true. But really, right, he wrote, I think, again, I looked quickly, but I think it was at least 25 books in his life on a variety of topics. But again, what animated him and what I think really made him unique was that he was a champion of the belief that Torah, if articulated correctly, understood correctly, and articulated correctly, has something deep and profound to teach everyone. And the entire world, not just Jews, right? Definitely not just Orthodox Jews, but humanity. Because the Torah was written by God. And the Torah didn't begin as a book to Jews. Right? The beginning of the story of the Torah is not a national one, it's a universal one. And Avram, who is the father of our nation, is also the father of other nations, and is seen consistently in his role as someone from whom blessing will flow to the entire world. Right? And he very much lived by this theology that to do justice to the Torah is to recognize that it has a message for all of humanity. And it is a testament to him, both in terms of just his education, his eloquence, that he managed to get people who otherwise would not be connected, both within the Jewish community and without, to see that that was the case. And that's no small feat. Right? And again, like I said, he was a unique Talmid Chacham in that sense, right? He didn't write halachic works. He didn't write works on Gemara, right? Most of his work was in philosophy. And to be fair, most of his work was not academic. Right? He was a very, very educated, academically trained philosopher. And some of his earlier work, you'll see, if you read it, is much more written in an academic style. But the things he's most known for are the things that are profound and yet clearly popular works. Right? And I think that was by design. He once came when I was in YU to speak about his new translation of the Siddur, right? The Koren translation, which probably some of you have. And I've probably mentioned this to some of you before, but he said, why did he spend so much time working on the Siddur? Because he said he spent years in the academy, getting a degree and eventually a doctorate in philosophy in the best of the best universities in the world. But at some point, he became disenchanted with philosophy as such, partly because he realized that Chazal never wrote philosophical works. And he said, what did Chazal do if they wanted you to believe in certain philosophical principles? They thought they were important that you should know them. He put them in the Siddur. And as he said very simply, he said, how many people knew, or even today know, about the long form of the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim? And how many people have ever read the Yud Gimel Ikarim in their original, in Perush HaMishnayah? By contrast, how many people are vaguely aware of the beliefs that are in them, leaving aside the differences between the Rambam's own theology as it's presented there and the way it is? How many people are aware of the Ani Bamins, which is the shortened version? And how many people know Yigdal, which is a poetic rendition of the Yud Gimel Ikarim? Right? He said, why? Because in the end of the day, if you only write philosophical treatises, they're important. But if you only write philosophical treatises, that belies a philosophy, that dogma, that the fundamentals of religion are meant for the elite who can read that. But Chazal felt that things that are important should be, at least in some form, accessible to all people. And therefore, he said he engaged in a translation of the Siddur when he realized that the real place that philosophy makes its way into the hearts and minds of the average person is not through highfalutin philosophical analysis. That has its place, and that's important. But he decided to involve himself in a translation of the Siddur because he realized that Chazal seemed to have had this approach of finding ways of making sure that the average person could identify with those messages. And when he said that, he was talking about the Siddur, but I really think it summed up, from what I know of Rabbi Sacks, his philosophy of life. Right? The reason that his books are really accessible. And again, for some people that's frustrating. Right? Some people like dense philosophy, and they don't just like manifestos, which is, arguably what a lot of them are, right? They're his position on life through, admittedly, very insightful parshanut of Tanakh, but they read like drushot, right? Which for some people is frustrating. They want a philosophical arguments, right? This is a combination of parshanut and inspiration, right, and rhetoric. But that was his point, right? Much of his greatness was that he managed to say very insightful things and very profound things, but specifically chose to do it in a way that it wasn't relegated only to the intellectual elite. And he was wildly successful in that, right? Because again, it wasn't just the hundreds of thousands of people who read his Divrei Torah every week, or listened to his podcast every week, or watched his conversations, or his debates with atheists, or his debates with who knows what. Again, the Queen of England knighted him and then made him a lord. Right? He was recognized as a thought leader, not just by Jews in England, but by Jews across the world and by non-Jews across the world. And by design, right? He was definitely someone, you read his earlier works, you see he's capable of writing in the very highfalutin philosophical language. Right? That was his training. But he believed that his goal in life was to inspire the world with the messages of God, not by dumbing it down, but by simplifying it. Right? This is something I think I heard it from Rabbi Jonathan, right? The difference between, right, simplifying and dumbing down, right? He didn't dumb it down. He just simplified it, meaning there's one thing which is to make an idea less complex than it is. The other, which is not to write it in such a way that people get lost, right? But the basic profound idea is deep. You just don't try to make it that no one can understand. And he was amazing at that, right? At simplifying profound ideas. And, I am by no stretch of the imagination qualified to speak about all the ideas, but I'll talk about one or two that I think are particularly resonant. And they were some that I saw in my quick perusal of my friends who knew him better last night on Facebook, of them identifying these things in his thought. One of them was his very fundamental belief that, and I think we can all somewhat agree with him, that something is deeply broken in the modern world and the modern political climate, and that something had to be done to fix it, right? This was before the last 4 years, which have gotten worse. And I don't care which side you're on, and I know that people in this Beit Midrash, I know from the debate, you're on different sides of this, right? But I think all of us can admit that the last 4 years has been so polarizing and so disastrous to the norms of civility, and I don't care who you think who is at fault for this, right? But you cannot deny that we are in a poisonous situation. One of his claims that he captured in his book, I think, To Heal a Broken World, was that he believes that the West's obsession with government being founded on social contract is a mistake. Because he notes that in the Torah, all political structures, pretty much any structure whatsoever, is presented not as a contract, but as a covenant. And he said, what's the difference? Though he wrote a whole book about it, so I can't summarize it in one line. But if I had to summarize in one line, right, the difference was that covenant focuses on relationship. Right? That it's not just enough to say, I have a deal with you, but it's that I need to find a way of having a relationship with you. And he said, and he felt that that was lost from the modern world, right? That everyone cares about my rights, and everyone cares about what do I owe you and what do you owe me, but no one cared to talk about the fact that the reason that I owe you things are because we have joined together in society to build something together, and with that comes obligations. But the Torah always talks in that way. Right? All the contracts we have are functions of covenants. Right? The reason we're obligated to God is because we have a covenant with him. We have a history with him. And that's even God, who could just force himself on us by power. God introduces himself by saying, I did something for you. I took you out of Egypt so that I could be your God and you would be my people. And these are the implications that flow from that covenant. Right? Even God does that. So one of his major claims, right, was that the whole notion of we're broken because we've stopped looking at each other as people and recognizing that the only way to build a society is by creating a covenant, where we create a relationship and our obligations to each other are predicated on the backdrop of a relationship. Right. Another thing, on my way here, I was trying to get inspiration, so I listened to one of his shiurim that I could find in YU Torah as I was running out. Was a lecture he gave, I think at YU, on autonomy. Right, where he said that one of the things that he just felt was terrible, right, that led to so much problems is, and this relates to the point I just said, is that the West is obsessed with the I. Right? This story, I think I heard it from him also once. Right? But he claimed that this summed up his philosophy of life, so I'll tell the story from him. He said that when he went to visit America, whatever it was, 30, 40 years ago, he stopped by the Rav, he stopped by different leaders, and one of the leaders who was very influential in his life was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he stopped by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he said while he was waiting in the waiting room, the Hasidim said to him that, that before the Rebbe was the Rebbe, he was the editor of the Chabad press. And he was a very, very careful editor. Okay? Apparently he was a very careful writer as well. He's very organized. If you ever read the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which, again, I'm no expert in the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but he's very, very organized. And he was very good at capturing problems just by, in a way, an editor does. And they told him the following story of one time that the Lubavitcher Rebbe got a letter from someone who said, I'm so depressed, I try, I daven, but it doesn't resonate with me. I learn Torah, but it doesn't inspire me. I keep the mitzvot, I do Shabbos, but it doesn't warm my heart, etc., etc., etc. What should I do? And he said the Lubavitcher Rebbe didn't respond anything. He took the guy's letter, he took a red pen, I guess, right, and he just did one thing. He circled the beginning of every sentence that started with I and sent it back to him. Right? And he told him, right, what was he telling him? He said, the reason you don't find anything meaningful is because the key to finding meaning is to stop thinking about yourself all the time. And if everything is I, then you're right. You will feel lonely and you will feel that life is meaningless. But if you start thinking about you and about we, then suddenly that opens up vistas in terms of how you pursue meaning. Because you recognize that it's about relationship. You recognize it's about community. And your place in that community, admittedly. And he said for him, right, that captures so much of what's wrong and why there's so much problems. Right? It's one of the many problems that he identified in the West, right, was that there is this obsession with the I. Right? The way he called it was the culture of the selfie. Right? I take a picture of myself. Right? He was like, that for him, and he said, it's not an accident that the political situation is broken, that mental health problems have gone up, right? Because people are depressed and people try to find meaning, but it's hard because you can't just find meaning if it's all about I. Right? And he noted that there's an obsession in the West of autonomy in the Kantian sense of the word. Right? The way it has been commonly understood is that Kant felt that heteronomy, anytime someone commands you something, it's meaningless. The only law that has meaning is if you command it to yourself, autonomos, right? Self-commanded, self-legislated. Right? But he said in Torah, and this, he said, the Torah also believes in autonomy, but not in the Kantian sense. Namely, that things are only meaningful if you commanded yourself and not if someone else is in the picture. Right? But he said, the Gemara says that in Kedushin Daf Lamed Bet, that Rava is a Hava Amina, that a Talmid Chacham is not allowed to waive his honor because the Torah is not his honor, it's the honor of the Torah, and therefore he's not allowed to waive it. But then Rava retracts, and he says it's not true. Because if you look at the first pasuk in Tehillim, the first two pasukim rather in Tehillim, it starts off by saying U'v'Torato Yehegeh, U'v'Torat Hashem Chepso, that it's the Torah of God, and then at the end of the pasuk it says U'v'Torato Yehegeh, in His Torah. And Rava says at the beginning it's Torah Hashem, and at the end Nase Torato. That once you learn the Torah, it becomes yours, and therefore you can be mochel your honor. So what Rabbi Sacks suggested was that what the Gemara is telling you, we believe in autonomy. But not autonomy in the sense that nothing that someone else gives you can be meaningful. You have to come up with it yourself. But autonomy in the sense that in order for something to be meaningful, you have to get to the point where you internalize it, and you would command it yourself. Right? You identify with it. So you want to do it. But it's allowed to be meaningful even if it came from outside. Or even if someone else told you, you don't have to come up with everything yourself. Yes, we want you to identify with it. We don't want you to just do the mitzvah because God told you and you do it out of submission. We want you to get to the point that you identify with it. But we don't think that something is puzzle, something is invalid just because it came from outside you. We believe that there is possibility of meaning coming from outside, and you should be open to that and not obsessively think that only if I came up with it myself and it's me. If that's the way you live life, you'll never find meaning, right? You will never learn anything. You will never inculcate new values. You will never imbibe new messages. And again, he wrote like 25 books, and I have not read all of them, right? I've read some of them. But I think what he did that is really notable, that he will be remembered for, was, as I said, believing very deeply that the Torah isn't just meant to speak to a small sliver of people, that it can and should, and when articulated properly, will inspire the world at large. Because it's written by God. And God started off the Torah not talking to the Jewish people, but talking to humanity, then that tells you that if you say it the right way, you present it in a way people will understand, you don't have pretenses and insist on writing everything in highfalutin language that no one can talk to, and you don't think it's beneath you to say it in simple language, and maybe even to say it in English, that suddenly you'll be able to penetrate the hearts of people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. And he was the champion of that in a way that I don't think anyone else was, at least in many, many years. And as I said, he therefore actively tried to find solutions to the ills that he identified in the West. As much as he was integrated in it, he wasn't afraid to say that the Torah has a different perspective. And some of the perspectives that he came back to over and over again, as I said, was this notion that we have to stop thinking only about the I. And the other is that we have to, which is related to that point, is that we have to think about relationship. Right? That things will work much better if we believe that we're actually in this together. Right? And we don't have our entire political discourse about what do I owe you and what do you owe me and am I getting what is coming to me? Right? And it's not constantly you versus us, right? But it's we're in this together. We're actually in a relationship. We may disagree, but we're in a relationship, and that's why we have obligations to each other. Not just because I can demand it for you in court, but because we're in this together. Right? Those were some of his insights that he suggested towards healing a broken world, as he called the book. And, again, just in the few minutes I took to look at people's brief eulogies they were posting as the news was coming out, several people mentioned, and I think I definitely identify with this, and from the people nodding, I see that you identify as well. We're at a point where Rabbi Sacks' message, that message alone, really hits home, because the political situation in America, in Israel, pretty much anywhere, right? But for most of us, those are the two countries where we are involved with, is so broken, right? Because often we just don't think about that. And if we can do anything in his memory, it's to recommit ourselves to caring about others. It's recommitting ourselves to the belief that the Torah has something to say that is meaningful to the world, and to try to actually implement that in our lives in a way that will make our lives and the lives of those around us, Jewish and not Jewish, better. Okay, and again, I will qualify for the 10th time. I'm not a scholar of Rabbi Sacks' thought. And if I misconstrued some of his ideas or didn't do justice to them, that's because I haven't read everything he wrote, and because Rabbi Ginsburg asked me while I was, driving, and I only saw it when I got here. Can you say a few words of Rabbi Sacks? Okay, so these are initial thoughts. Right? But even from that, with those qualifications, even from that level of distance, to appreciate those basic insights and that basic approach to life, I think should inspire us. And I really think it should inspire us that there are people who have managed to get the world to believe that the Torah has something to say about how to create a better society in 2020. Right? The fact that there were people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, who looked to Rabbi Sacks as a thought leader, right, gave him knighthood and lordship, and because of his beliefs, is a testament to the fact that the Torah has those things. And I think sometimes we forget that. Because sometimes I think we get caught up in the minutia, and that's great. I don't want you to start reading, philosophy all morning and not learn Gemara, okay? I want you to keep coming to share. Guys in my share, you keep coming to share. We will keep focusing on the line. But part of the reason that sometimes at the end of a sugya, right, or peppered in throughout the sugya, I'll mention, that this lumdish idea points to a bigger philosophical question or a bigger social question, is because I think it's important that we remind ourselves that the Torah isn't just this parochial text that we can sit around and split hairs and lumdos, which is important. I really do believe it's important. And that's why I spend so much time in Gemara and halacha that is admittedly not for the world. Right? Hilchos Shabbos, Hilchos Kashrus, Hilchos Nida, whatever it might be, right? I spend much of my time, if not most of my time, in that area. But the reason that I make sure when I'm learning to pepper in that this speaks to a broader idea, right, that you should reflect on that, is because I think we would be derelict in our responsibility to Torah if we didn't sometimes take that insight that Rabbi Sacks personified and at least give it some thought, which is that if God gave this Torah to the world, it has something to say to the entire world. And when we find the ways to articulate those meta values, not only do we have the ability to inspire others, but we also inspire ourselves, because we remember what's at stake in the Torah that we're learning. And if we can do something, right, to access memory, I think it would be to take those insights, incorporate that into the way we learn, into the way we think, and commit ourselves to learning Torah in such a way that we believe that if presented properly, it'll inspire the world, that indeed Hashem gave the world a gift that can help us, whether it's 3,500 years ago or 2020. And I would encourage you, as you're learning, as you're thinking, to find ways to reflect on those ideas in the Torah in your own way. And again, I encourage you, if it speaks to you, to read Rabbi Sacks' books inside. But even if it doesn't, and even if they don't, what he accomplished and what he represented I think is something that it should inspire us in the way we think, and the way we live, and the way we learn. Okay? I hope I did it somewhat justice. I really cannot promise, but to do it, to not say anything, I think would be really quite derelict. And like I said, this is not to take away from David Feinstein, who also passed away. That at least we are zocha to have someone who can speak about it from personal experience, so I'll leave that to Rabbi Chait. But both of them, as we close, Yehi Zichram Baruch, and let us